I'm Marion Quinn. I'm the CEO with the Childhood Development Initiative, and it's really lovely to have all of you with us. This event is being live streamed, so if you prefer to leave your camera off, then by all means do that. Minister O'Brien, thank you for joining us for the entirety of this morning. We're delighted to have you here and to have you officially launch the report. But we do also appreciate your time's precious, so thank you very much for joining us to listen in on the presentation, and to our panel members as well. So we're very grateful.
You're very welcome.
For making that time. Thank you. So I'll just explain how we're going to run the morning. I'm going to hand over to Mary O'Brien in a moment from TUSLA, and Mary's going to say some opening remarks on behalf of TUSLA, who funded the research. Jeffrey, my colleague here in CDI, Jeffrey Shumber, who's the main author of the report Over the Fence, is going to then do a presentation on the key findings from the research that we've done here in Tallaght. And then we have two panelists, Kat Chen from Trinity and Tanya Ward from the Children's Rights Alliance. I'll introduce them more fully when we come to that, but both Kat and Tanya are going to, from quite different perspectives, I suspect, they're both going to give some responses to the report and reference some of the kind of wider contextual issues. And then before we invite the Minister to formally launch the report, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. I'll keep an eye on the chat box. If you have a question or a comment, or if you'd like to share a reflection, pop it into the chat box. You can message me personally if you would prefer your question to be private, and I won't reference who it comes from. And if you're happy, you can just put it into the chat for everybody to see. But it would be really great if we just had some kind of engagement with all of you this morning as well. Okay, so I think we've a lot more people who registered, but oh no, we've a good few here. It's very hard to see when it crosses over two screens. So lovely, lots of different organisations, which is really good. So thank you all for joining us. Okay, so I'm going to sort of start formally by inviting Mary O'Brien to make some opening comments. So as I said, Mary's from TUSLA. She's the Senior Support Network Coordinator here in South Dublin, and anybody who works in the Tallaght area knows her as Mehel Mary. Mary's involved in every organisation, every structure, every platform, every network. So we're delighted to have her join us this morning to say a few opening remarks from TUSLA. So Mary, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, Minister, Marion, Jeffrey, and everybody on the call, who I won't be able to list because I believe there's quite a good gathering this morning, which I'm delighted about. TUSLA welcomes this report Over the Fence, as it highlights the emerging needs through the lens of our children, young people and families. Their voice, lived experience is represented in the report, which helps us understand the multidimensional issues that are experienced in the community of Tallaght. The report will help us shape services, meet those in need, a roadmap to aid planning and service delivery, give us a framework to tackle child poverty, which is at the heart of TUSLA's mission, meeting the needs of those most vulnerable. I'm delighted the positive sense of community spirit was captured from the children, young people and families in the report, as that's been my experience of the last 23 years working in Tallaght. However, the multidimensional issues of mental health, anxiety, housing, the lack of educational and work opportunities in this report needs to be listened to, as it comes from the voice of the community, who know their situation best, and for improvements and outcomes to be achieved. TUSLA is committed to using the report as a roadmap.
Cancer support group.
You're on mute, Mary. Somebody's muted you.
Really sorry, I don't know who muted me and how they muted me. I didn't touch the screen. These are the Zoom disasters. Sorry, guys. TUSLA are committed to using the report as a roadmap to highlight the needs through CIPSI, fund services in a meaningful way to children, young people and their families through the commissioning processes, interagency collaboration, MEHL and family support services. The COVID recovery plan has to target those most in need. The report gives us the evidence and the voice and the lived experience to highlight the importance of services working together and ensuring families get the right help at the right time. The report will be a framework for working together on a comprehensive plan, a vision to match the voice of the children, young people and families represented in the research. The report can aid TUSLA, its partners, voluntary and statutory services through CIPSI to have child poverty at the heart of planning, decision making and target resources to meet the holistic needs of the community shared in this report. Thanks for the report. The voice of those who know their situation best is well represented. TUSLA is happy to have funded this report to help inform service delivery in the future. So I hope this sets the scene for our Jeffrey to come up and tell us more about the report. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Mary. And I think that was me that muted you. Apologies. Nothing personal. So thanks, that was a really nice opening. Actually, we touched on so many kind of key principles. So that combination of evidence and lived experience as a way of informing planning and decision making is exactly the kind of approach that CDI likes to take, and indeed the National Area-Based Childhood Programme. So thank you. I'm sure when you're listening to Jeffrey, obviously a lot of people here this morning are from Tallaght and the South Dublin area, but some of you are from much further afield. I think when you listen to Jeffrey, there will be resonance wherever you are. So whilst this research is about children and families in Tallaght, I think that the experience of child poverty, and particularly in the context of a global pandemic, translates across the country to any disadvantaged area. So I'm going to hand over to Jeffrey. So Jeffrey has done the most amazing work consulting directly with children, young people, parents and service providers in the midst of a global pandemic, and doing a whole load of primary and secondary data, looking at a range of data from the census through to KPIs from the HSE and TUSLA and so on. You're only going to hear a fragment of the work he's done. So I would encourage you to go to our website and get the full report subsequent to this. But I'm going to hand over to Jeffrey for an overview of the report and its findings. Thanks.
Thank you, Marian, and good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to share the presentation, and just allow me to bring the presentation up. Okay, so I'm going to do a presentation of the study that we did in Tallaght with children and families and service providers, which mainly centers on the perspectives and experiences of child poverty. So the session overview has already been covered by Marian, and I'm just going to skip that. But before I start, I just wanted to give an overview of Tallaght, just giving the key characteristics or some of the key statistics about Tallaght. So you would realize that Tallaght is one of the fastest growing county towns, and between 2011 to 2016, there's been a 6.4 increase in the population. And you would notice that almost 28% of the population in Tallaght is made up of children that is below 18 years of age. And you'll also notice that in terms of employment, almost 26% of children lived in households where no one was working. And the breakdown of the 25,119 households in Tallaght in terms of work situation is as follows. So like 36% of the households, they had at least 2% working, and 35% of households, they had only 1% working, while 30% of households had nobody working. So just more about the background of the study. So what we wanted to find out when we did this study, first of all, we wanted to understand how children understand and experience child poverty, and also what do children, parents, and service providers feel to be the causes of child poverty in Tallaght. More to that, we didn't just want to find out their experiences or their perspectives, but we also wanted to consult with them on what is the impact of child poverty, and how can we address child poverty, what will need to happen locally, that is in Tallaght, and nationally. But because we planned this study during the pandemic, we also had to adapt our study and to capture how families, children were coping through the pandemic. So we also added another question on understanding generally how families were coping, how were they finding the pandemic, how were they coping through the pandemic. And then moving on to how we conducted the study, we mainly did our study through a qualitative approach. So we consulted with children between ages of 8 years to 17 years through 6 focus group discussions, and we had 50 children. So how we consulted with the children is we did a range of activities during the focus group discussions. We had to include art, we had to include games, we had to include story writing, so that we can capture the reach and the depth of children's experiences and their perspectives on child poverty. But we also did focus group discussions with service providers, and we had a range of service providers who are working with children and families in Tallaght. And we also did 2 focus group discussions with parents. So this gave us a comprehensive understanding of the perspectives and experiences of child poverty from the different angles, from the angles of the children, from the angles of the parents, and the angles of the service providers. So moving on to the key findings, one thing that we always find out when we conduct a community research in Tallaght is the community, they love their community, they love Tallaght, they really belong, they really feel they belong to Tallaght, and they identify a sense of community that exists in within the community. They feel a sense of belonging, the community working together, but also for children, more importantly, they identify the different green areas, the different community services for young children. They really loved the availability of those services. And also, what we realized as we were doing the study is service providers, they are really available, and they are quick to respond to the needs of the community. Like during the pandemic, many service providers, they responded to the issues of the community through food deliveries, through some of even of the service providers, as I will cover later. They responded to the deprivations of educational access through provision of various services and various devices for children to access online education. So generally, people felt Tallaght is their home and they belong there. Now moving on, one of the key things that we found in our study is the issue of food poverty. So while food poverty was prevalent before the pandemic, one thing that we noticed is service providers realized that the depth and the extent of food poverty was really unmasked during the pandemic. Like it was to such an extent that they had not really imagined. So this was mainly because before the pandemic, schools were open and children could access at least a meal from the school. And some of the children actually took food home from school. But because with the pandemic, everything was closed, the services were closed and the schools were closed, that support system was stopped. So we saw a spike in food poverty for families and children in Tallaght. But one thing that really worked well, or that we should commend the service providers in Tallaght for, is their response to the food poverty through the different food deliveries, food banks, and food vouchers that they provided for the families. That provided a cushion for the families to have that to have access to food. We also realized that parents shared experiences of a deepening housing crisis in Tallaght. So they pointed out to the challenges that come with the deepening of the housing crisis, including homelessness, overcrowding, and even because of the pandemic, some of the families that moved back to live with their parents and with their grandparents, they could not afford the rent during the pandemic. So we realized that parents were sharing experiences of homelessness, overcrowding, and even intergenerational living, which had its own effects on children. But more importantly, we realized that parents and families, because of the housing crisis, they were moving between emergency accommodation, and this did not have a positive impact on their mental well-being and even the emotional well-being of children. So you had children being moved from one emergency accommodation to the other, and this really negatively impacted on their emotional well-being. We also realized that parents themselves, they experienced mental health because of accommodation challenges. And what really struck us is the multidimensionality of the challenges, because experiencing mental health, experiencing emotional well-being challenges because of the deepening housing crisis, it did impact on the child-parent relationship. So some of the parents, especially parents who are raising families alone, they could not be available for their children in terms of emotional availability as they were experiencing housing crisis. And generally, parents were now afraid of experiencing or going through homelessness. So we saw that accommodation was deepening, and it did have impact on the other dimensions of well-being for children and families. And generally, also parents, they shared a perceived neglect of Tallaght, which led to the creation of ghettos. Basically, I'll just try to summarize here. They thought that Tallaght as a community is surrounded by new and upcoming communities which are well built, but Tallaght itself, in terms of the accommodation, it was not really well built. So they were making comparisons between Tallaght and the new upcoming communities that are surrounding Tallaght, and they felt that their housing needs, they were being neglected. So they thought that created kind of ghettos in Tallaght. But what we really found out is the main challenges were procedural, or were pointing to bureaucracy in accessing social housing. So we had parents sharing their experiences of trying to access social housing or housing assistance program, and how difficult the process was for them. So those are some of the key challenges that we found in terms of accommodation for families. And also, more importantly, on mental health and drug abuse, we found that parents, generally from parents, children, and service providers' perspectives, there was a perceived high prevalence of mental health problems. And we found that mental health was again linked to the different dimensions or to the different challenges that parents experienced. That again brings up how child poverty is multidimensional. So like what I've said previously, housing was linked to experiences of mental health challenges. And also service providers, especially those who were working in the drug and substance abuse sector, they shared that children were now resorting to the use of substances and drugs as a way of escaping from the different mental health difficulties that they faced. so those were some of the drivers of mental health, especially the challenges to do with housing and the use of drug and substance use. Again, we also realized that during COVID, mental health challenges spiked for families and for children. There was that general anxiety. Families experienced isolation during the pandemic, and it did really impact on their mental health. Also, we realized that for parents who were experiencing mental health, they were really not available for their children. It really did impact again on the parent-child relationship. But from the service providers that were working with families and children and young people in drug and substance use, they also noted that there is an increase in drug use for children. And in fact, young people as the age of 13 years, they were now engaged in drug and substance use and using the different drugs. So those are some of the key issues that were coming out from in relation to mental health and drug use. And in relation to the impact of COVID, generally what we found is COVID affected all the dimensions of well-being for children, from material deprivation, socio-emotional well-being, educational well-being. So, but the most affected dimension of well-being for children that we noticed relates to education. We realized that while we thought that many children will be able to access online education, this was not the case, as children did not have the devices to access online education, and they did not even have the internet itself in terms of accessing online education. So with the closure of schools, some of the children, they were disproportionately affected because they could not access online education. However, something that we noted from some of the service providers who participated in our focus group discussions is they were quick to respond to the needs of the children and families. Some of them were lending devices like computers and laptops for families to use for children to access online education. However, they could not provide access to the internet. So again, that meant children, even though they had the devices, they were still deprived in terms of accessing education. And for parents, it was really an extra cost for them to access, to purchase devices and to purchase internet services for children to access online education. And more importantly, what we also noticed is for some parents, they were engaged in different upskilling programs to boost their socioeconomic status, but because most of the services or the programs that were providing them with the trainings that moved to online education, they could not access those trainings and those courses. So that's how that's the extent of how COVID affected access to education for families and for children. And we also find out that children were generally uncertain about how they were going to progress with their education because schools were closed and reopened again, and they were not so certain if schools were going to continue to open. And in relation to the safety of the community, we realized that from children and the parents that we consulted with, they felt a perceived increase in antisocial behavior and bullying in the neighborhood. And they also felt that the rate of crime, for example, break-ins, was increasing in the community. So that was a major concern for them. But also they felt that although there were green areas for children, they were not so safe for children to play in. For some of the experiences that we gathered is some of the playgrounds, they had smashed glasses in them, and some of them they were bent. So although those places were available, they were not really so safe for children to play in. And generally, parents and service providers expressed concern in terms of the care of the environment because of some of the different challenges, including dumping and litter that could be found on the roads. So what we really found out is from the service providers' perspective and from the parents' perspective, one of the major challenges that was leading to the different challenges that I've spoken about in relation to community safety, there was a gradual lack of responsibility and the community generally looking after each other. So the references that were given by the parents and service providers during the years that they grew up, they had the community looking after each other, and generally children were responsible, like the older children were responsible for the younger children. So there was no bullying and people generally cared for their environment. But they referenced to that responsibility gradually dwindling, which resulted in the different challenges in relation to community safety. And also we found out that bullying and fitting in was prevalent among children and young people. Also referenced by the parents, were the dwindling in community platforms for children and young people to learn to be responsible. So this is generally related to the different activities at community level, where children could meet, where children could just socialize as children and learn how to relate to each other and how to be friends to each other. So after finding all these different issues in the community, we also went further to consult with children, service providers and parents on what will be their priorities for Tallaght to be a better place. So children, again, all of the participants that we consulted with, they referenced to housing and material well-being as an area that really needs attention. And also there were references to early intervention, especially children living with disabilities. So early intervention for children in relation to assessments of needs, the different health services that are required by children, including speech and language therapy. And also the reference to community safety, referencing to the different interventions that will need to be implemented for the safety of the community to be improved. And generally, they also made references to the need of increasing the availability of community platforms where children could just meet as children and socialize and learn to pro-social behaviors. And there was also the need to address the mental health for children and even for parents. So these are some of the priorities that children and families identified. So what will be the implications of our study? We realized that child poverty is more than just an income issue. So although income remains central, it remains key. It remains a key contributor to child poverty. How children experience child poverty is more than just an income issue. Children experience child poverty in different ways. Their mental health, their socio-emotional well-being, their educational well-being. So we realize that child poverty goes beyond just being an income issue. And if we need to address it, it needs to be addressed holistically, like focusing on all the dimensions of child poverty, which links into the next point on child poverty being multidimensional. We realize that being deprived in one dimension consequently leads to being deprived in another dimension. For example, children who experience housing and accommodation challenges, they also experience socio-emotional well-being challenges like mental health and all those things. So child poverty, again, it needs to be treated as a multidimensional concept, which means addressing one dimension of child poverty should be linked with interventions that address the other dimensions of child poverty. Also, we saw the value of engaging with children and young people. They understand, they know best how they experience child poverty. They know best what will be the interventions to address child poverty for them. So it's really important to engage with children and young people, capture their voice, in trying to address child poverty. We also consulted with parents, children, and service providers, and they shared with us the different experiences, their different perspectives. So it is really key that we make a meaningful change in their community and in their lives. So we have to use the voices that they gave us. We have to use the different experiences that they gave us to create or to address child poverty by implementing the different interventions that will improve outcomes for children and parents. So moving on to some of our recommendations, we realize that material deprivation is really one of the ways that children experience child poverty, although it goes beyond material deprivation. So it's really important that the material deprivation aspect and access to adequate income for households is addressed, but it should also be complemented by the different interventions that support the other different dimensions of well-being for children. And we also realize that while the children are receiving at least one nutritious meal at school, this should also be complemented with guaranteeing children access to at least one nutritional meal of school. So it should not just be about accessing a nutritious meal at school, but also off school. And also, more importantly, we need to address the impact of the pandemic. So a COVID recovery plan is required for affected children because children were disproportionately affected and in different dimensions of well-being. More importantly, we need targeted investments in early childhood so that we address some of the different challenges, some of the child poverty experiences at an early stage before they can grow to be a bigger challenge. And more importantly, again, we need to involve children and young people in developing policies. Again, they know best what they need, and they know best how we can address child poverty. And as we know, we had the brighter outcomes with the BOBIF, which expired in 2020. And one of our recommendations is we need another national children's strategy to be implemented so that we can have a clear focus and a clear strategy on how to improve children's outcomes. So basically, that's what we found in our study. That's just a snapshot of our study. And we would like to thank the children that we consulted, the young people, the parents, and the service providers, and also the gatekeepers who gave us access to these participants and anyone else who contributed to the study. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Jeffrey. Well done. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Jeffrey's hopefully given you a flavour of the report, and we do particularly want to thank Ankasan and Citywise and Troiga, all of whom were really, I mean, we would never have had access to all the participants without them, so thanks to everybody for that. Okay, so hopefully you've got lots of stuff going around in your head, lots of questions and comments and thoughts, reflections. So I'm going to pass over to the first of our panelists. So we have Yekaterina or Kat, Yekaterina Chen, who's an assistant professor of sociology in Trinity College in Dublin. Kat was really helpful to us in developing the kind of methodology for this study. And she was a great find for us because Kat had come from the Innocenti Research Centre in Florence. And lots of us who are involved in child poverty will be aware of the work that the Innocenti Centre has done on child poverty. So we were delighted to make that contact, and really great to have you here this morning, Kat. So I'm going to hand over to you to hear your thoughts and reflections on what people have heard.
Thank you so much, Marian. Jeffrey's presentation is a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. Can you see the slides and can you hear me? Great, excellent. So I'll jump right in. So I would just like to share some reflections on the findings from the report that primarily have to do with the way that we think about child poverty and the way we measure it. But before I go into that, I would just like to take a quick step back and reflect on why we are concerned with child poverty. Well, because as we all know, it has long-lasting effects on not just children's living conditions here and now, and their well-being outcomes in key areas such as education, health, socio-emotional development, and so on and so forth, but also on the so-called life chances, or adult outcomes in the future. So anything related to educational attainment, how far they go in their education, their occupational attainment, what sort of jobs they do, how far they go in those jobs, and also things related to their adult health, family formation, and even involvement in things like crime. Now, children, of course, are a very unique demographic, as we all know, because even though they have rights enshrined in international law and national law, in their day-to-day lives, they very much depend on their caregivers, on their families for care and protection, while at the same time, they have little, or they have limited say in any decisions within their families on how resources are shared, and also how resources are generated. So in a way, children are the most vulnerable in society, and they have no responsibility for the circumstances of their birth or even the circumstances of their upbringing, because for any individual child, the family that they're born into, it's pretty much an outcome of a lottery. And we all understand that. And there is a rhetoric around that that pretty much says that, children are blameless, but at the same time, they can be very interesting rhetoric around child poverty in a way that parents are in some ways blamed for how they are raising their children. And the report Over the Fence, this excellent piece of research, is really helping us understand that poverty is primarily about the lack of income, and parents very much try to do the best for their children. So I'll briefly go over some of the key takeaways from this piece of research. For me, given my area of study, this is not in any way an exclusive or exhaustive list. For example, I won't comment on the findings related to mental health because this is not my area of expertise. But what we can see from this piece of work that relates to child poverty conceptualization and measurement is that local area conditions matter very much. And when we look at national child poverty statistics, things like the proportion of children nationally living in households in relative poverty, something like below 60% of the national median, that very much hides the enormous local variation across the Republic, including in areas, county towns like Tallaght. Now, local area conditions matter not only because of things like neighborhood safety or the availability and accessibility of key services for children and families, but as we can see from Over the Fence, community spirit also matters. Mutual help networks matter a lot, particularly during such trying times as a pandemic and a series of lockdowns. Housing comes up again and again in the report, and it's not only things around security of tenure, risk of homelessness, or the physical quality of housing, but very much things around the lack of privacy for children, a lack of a quiet place to study, especially during remote schooling, overcrowding, intergenerational living. Now, we also see that household income is very much the primary driver of child poverty and deprivation. You can see it clearly in issues around food poverty, where the report clearly highlights that food poverty is about not having enough money for food, rather than not having specialized knowledge of child nutrition and how to cook nutritious meals. This is primarily about income, and you can also see it in other dimensions of child deprivation. This matters to how we think about poverty. Of course, the report underlines, and Jeffrey already said that a few minutes ago, that poverty for children is not just about low income, but low income still matters a lot, and we must not discount it and come up with child poverty measurements that do not involve anything related to income at all. The report also shows very clearly that we do need to think about children's own perceptions and experiences. We have to involve them in research the way that this study did. Qualitative research, participatory methods matter a lot here. And it's really exciting how this particular study used innovative and creative age-appropriate methods of engaging children and getting them to talk about their experiences and perceptions. Now, my last point here is that this is a reasonably small scale study, but it does tell us a lot about how children think about their own circumstances and how they understand child poverty. Now, we would also benefit greatly if we had national indicators that are based on child-focused and child-centered child deprivation data. And let me just take a couple of minutes to explain what I mean here. So in Ireland, we have an official measure of enforced material deprivation. There are 11 items. If a household cannot afford 2 or more out of these, they are counted as deprived. Now, all of these 11 items refer to things that are either about the household, such as number 7, keeping the home adequately warm, or they are about adult-specific needs, such as number 11, having a morning, afternoon, or evening out for entertainment. This is about adult needs rather than children's needs. Now, on the right-hand side, I just pulled up some of the themes, again, not an exclusive list or exhaustive list, but some of the key themes that are coming out from conversations with children. And what they need is toys, friends, activities, a warm and safe, non-overcrowded home. They need breakfast, 2 meals a day. So there is very little overlap between these two lists. Now, the interesting thing is that both Ireland and other European Union countries actually have a list of child-centered deprivation items that match very well what children in Tallaght have been saying. The only problem is that these indicators have not been collected since 2014. Now, the overlap here is great. We have items on things like toys, so indoor games, outdoor equipment such as bicycles, books. We have things around food and clothes and presents, several items on activities. So a regular leisure activity, celebrations, having friends over from time to time. These are child-centered, not adult-centered. So this is interesting because everything that children in Tallaght have been saying about child poverty, we already have a scientifically validated list of child deprivation items. It's just that they're not collected in Ireland or other European Union member states regularly, so not since 2014. And so it really would be great if we had more nationally representative data on child-focused deprivation items, which just happen to be very closely related to what children are saying in qualitative research. So I will stop here for the sake of time, and thank you very much. The report is really excellent. I enjoyed reading it, and it has value not only as an academic piece of study, but it also has so many useful lessons for policymakers, service providers, residents of Tallaght, and just the public at large. Thank you very much once again to Jeffrey and the team. I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. Thank you so much. That's so interesting, kind of looking at the list of indicators from a child's perspective. I've never even noticed how many of those indicators are really about what adults think we need as opposed to what children say they need. So thank you. That's really interesting, Kat. I'm going to now move on to our next panelist, which is Tanya Ward, who's the Chief Executive from the Children's Rights Alliance. I'm sure we all know Tanya and the work that the Alliance does in promoting children's rights more widely, but specifically in recent times, really helping us all to focus at both policy and practice level on children who are impacted by poverty. Just a quick reminder before I hand over to please use the chat box, because we will have time for some questions and answers or any reflections that you might have. So do pop any thoughts you might have into the chat box. Tanya, thanks for joining us, and I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Marion. Really delighted to have an opportunity to respond to this research, and just to acknowledge that Minister O'Brien is here for this event. I think that's very significant. First off, just well done to CDI for doing this research in the Tallaght area. The truth is there isn't a lot of research looking at the impact of child poverty on children and young people and families in Ireland. And I think one of the things that's happened in Ireland with the Combat Poverty Agency, the closure of the Combat Poverty Agency, it was an engine for this type of research at national level and actually at local level. It funded a lot of local interventions. And when the Combat Poverty Agency close its doors, you actually see a dearth of research emerging. Now, the Department of Children is obviously trying to address that with some recent pieces. You'll see that come out, and the former Minister for Children, Cassin Sapone, was very cognizant of this as well and commissioned research in this space. So this research, as Kat said, has an enormous contribution to make, actually, because essentially what it's doing is it's getting behind the statistics. It's giving you a sense of what children and young people and families in the local community are experiencing on a day-to-day level. And what's very rich about it is we know income is the main driver of poverty, but you can see how that the domino effect that has across the child's life and across the family's life as well, and that really comes through from the research. So what really struck me was, the people of Tallaght are experiencing the big national issues. They're experiencing issues around income and inadequacy in income. That's having a direct effect on what they can put on the table. And when the schools were closed during COVID, that affected families hugely. And housing issues, they're experiencing huge level of housing issues, overcrowded, poor quality housing. And what really struck me coming through the research, and again, the fact that you've focused on children and young people's voices, I think is very significant, because people experiencing poverty live in shame. Because unfortunately in our society, we don't see poverty as a systemic issue, that these are events that are created, that impacts on people, they have no control over them, and people feel a sense of failure, that they can't put food on their table. And children themselves are ashamed to tell their friends, I can't go to the birthday party or to the cinema, because they just don't want to tell them what's going on at home and the kind of stuff that they're living through. So amplifying the voice of people living through poverty is really important to break down those barriers and for people to really understand actually what is driving poverty in Ireland. But what really struck me was the mental health coming through and the huge disparity in educational outcomes for people nationally and then locally in the Tallaght area. And what was really striking, and we don't talk enough about this, I think, when we talk about poverty, is the built environment. Tallaght has lots of green spaces. It's one of its key strengths, obviously. But at the same time, the research is showing that it has very poor quality play areas that aren't upkept. And if you looked at the budget in the Department of Children about how much is put into play spaces and playgrounds, it's only a couple of 100,000. It's not that much at all. Then you understand why an area like Tallaght is experiencing this. And the other piece, I suppose, was around the bullying that children are experiencing, the kind of the violence, the antisocial behaviour. All of that happens in an area where you don't have investment in the local built-in structure, where you don't have good quality housing to good design standards, where you don't have good spaces for children to play safely, or for young people to hang out together, to play to be together independently. When you don't have those spaces, it does have a huge effect on people's emotional well-being, and you see that coming through in the Tallaght area. The other thing that really, I suppose, it depresses me in one way was to see the amount of people saying that childcare was a major problem for them. The affordability of it, and also the availability of it. It just wasn't available if you wanted to get into education and training and employment. And the one thing that shines through the data coming through on interventions that address child poverty is that training, education, and quality childcare actually is the most important intervention you can provide to a family if you want to help them lift them out of poverty. You can see direct correlations between the education and training of the mother and whether the child experiences poverty or not. And yet we have a situation in Tallaght where there's a huge disparity between the education of people nationally at third level and locally in Tallaght. You see families and young women saying, I don't have access to affordable childcare. It's not available in my local area. And that shouldn't be the case. We shouldn't be in a situation, if we're really committed to addressing child poverty, where that's actually happening for families. I really like to focus on the solutions and recommendations in the report towards the end, and it talks about this need for a new, better outcomes, brighter futures, and a focus on child poverty. That's really welcome. But what has really struck me over the years about this area is that we actually don't have a team in government that's trying to address child poverty. What we have is very committed and actually very expert people across government who actually have this background. Some of them have even worked in the Common Poverty Agency, and they're doing as much child poverty work as they can, but they do it alongside other day jobs. They might have 4 or 5 different things that they're doing. So that's very challenging for them, because if they were freed up to work specifically on child poverty, and as you say, it's multidimensional, you need to give them the day job focused on child poverty so they can come up with the solutions and implement them. And if you look at countries that have done this well, in the UK, when Tony Blair came to power, unfortunately the Tories have dismantled it all, but when he came to power, he had a child poverty unit in Whitehall, and it was very successful at rolling out national initiatives, and it had a big effect on their child poverty statistics. Scotland has a similar unit, as does New Zealand, and that's something we really need to think about. But the other thing that struck me about the research as well was this great insight into the local community in Tallaght. We now have solutions as to what's needed for people in Tallaght as well. But what do we have a plan? And I think what we really need as a next step is local child poverty plans, actually, with resources going in. So the local community and the service providers can come together. They can evaluate what the issues are in the local community and look at where the investments need to be made, and those investments are rolled out. That's something that's missing in Ireland, and it's something we really need to think about. And I think what this research has demonstrated is, local communities have the capacity to research and identify what the issues are and come up with the solutions as to what they actually need as well. So what we need, I think, is for government to respond to that and say, great, okay, we're going to empower you. We're going to give you the resources to plan the solutions at this local area and to empower local people who are experiencing this and going through it. I think then you'll see, it will help build a sense of community in the local area. If people are part of and planning the solutions, if they can see investments going into their local area as well. I mean, it's very striking that the people living in Tallaght really feel it. The City West is going up. There's better quality housing. There's better resources. There's lots of services going up. And what's happening to the people in Tallaght? Are they being forgotten about? And they can see the message that's having with people there. It's reinforcing a certain message, and that's just not good enough. I suppose I just want to finish, on the notion of hope and how important that is. And you will have seen, and it kind of echoes, I think, coming through this research, that the ESRI published a piece of work looking at the growing up in Ireland data, and they looked at the ages of 9 to 11 years. And what they found was, for children and young people who were experiencing, very high levels of material deprivation at the highest levels, something like 30% of them had a very poor negative view of themselves and what the possibilities are for their future. And that depressed me, because, if you have a very negative view about what's possible for yourself, that's going to perpetuate every aspect of your life. And that's something we really need to focus on, is to give every child hope, is to have high aspirations for them, that anything is possible for them. And I think a starting place is starting with the child poverty plan. It is starting with investing in the built up environment. It is starting with making sure all the supports and services are there. The local school has the IT equipment it actually needs. That's another thing coming through, that there are no waiting lists and speech and language appointments in the Tallaght area. All those things could be addressed if we had a commitment to addressing child poverty at a national level and a local level. So just to conclude, I just want to really commend Marion and Jeffrey for the really important work that you've done on the Tallaght area. And I really hope the story of what people are living through in Tallaght, you do get that out into the national domain, as well as the solutions that you've come up with and the local people have come up with as well. So congratulations, and look, delighted to take part in today's event.
Thanks, Tanya. As always, very pragmatic and solution focused, and a really great overview. I'm glad we moved from the stigma and the depression of the report to the hope at the end, because I have to say we had a number of meetings here in CDI during the course of this research that where we were wondering, what have we been doing? It feels as if things haven't really moved, despite huge effort and investment. So I'd absolutely agree. It's important that we have hope and aspirations, and that we look for the benefits as well as the difficulties. So thank you for all of that. The focus on a local as well as a national plan is an interesting one. There's a number of SITSI people here, members of South Dublin SITSI. Joe Rinn is with us, and I'm sure lots of others are members of SITSIs, and I think they're a key structure for us at more regional, local level. So that's something I'd be interested to hear what people have to say about that. There's one question in the chat box, which I'll come to in a moment, but I just want to ask, does anybody want to say anything? Put your hand up if you have a comment or a question or a reflection on anything that you've heard. You're all very shy. Okay, great. So I'll go to Joe and then P. Mulvaney. So Joe, thanks.
Thanks, Marion. I just was interested in terms of the research, maybe the profile of the families. Like, one of the things that we're aware through our SITSI work is the high profile and the high volume of known parents living across South Dublin County. It's a higher number than the national average, and I suppose just wondering, is that something that come through the researchers in an area that you'd focused on? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Joe. And I'm going to let Jeffrey respond to that, but there was also a question in the chat which he can respond to at the same time, which is, can you elaborate on the geographical location of respondents, also the factors driving child poverty, low income, and the solutions? So how will the educational deficits experienced by children be addressed? So I think Jeffrey certainly can give a response on the questions about the profile.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. So one thing that because we were just presenting on the snapshot of the report, one thing that we did not include is we conducted a secondary research where we looked at the different indicators of child poverty, and we were comparing the data at island level and the data at Tallaght level. So in terms of the geographical spread of the participants, one thing that we did, because we had access to the census data and the data from the HP portal, we kind of analyzed the different electoral divisions that are in Tallaght and identified the most disadvantaged electoral divisions in Tallaght. So what we ended up doing is we targeted recruitment of participants from the most disadvantaged electoral divisions of Tallaght. But maybe one thing to note is, of course, we had parents and children participating, but there is that possibility that they are not the most needy from these electoral divisions. So we do have the voice of the parents and children from the most disadvantaged electoral divisions, but they may not be the most disadvantaged parents from those electoral divisions. Mm-hmm. And for the profile of the parents, we had different mixes, a different mix of parents. We had parents who were in different work situations. We had some parents who were coming from households who were nanny. Nobody was working in the household, and we had parents who had at least one adult who was working in the household. So again, there's that mix of the parents in terms of their socioeconomic status. Marian, do you want to respond to the education?
I haven't got the solutions. I mean, so there was a question in the chat box following on from that one about the profile. How are we going to address the deficits? So, I mean, that's the challenge for all of us, isn't it? I mean, certainly for us in CDI, we've been using our Doodle Den and Doodle Families programs to try and help to retain children's interest in learning, and also to offer some sort of toolkit to parents so that they can help children to sustain their learning and catch up if that's the issue. We're also very fortunate that we have the Dolly Parton Imagination Library, so we have children who have continued to receive books throughout the pandemic, and we supplement that with information about how to use the books, how to engage children, and so on in reading and storytelling. So, you know, we're doing what we can, but I think as we all know, it is about a multifaceted, cross-disciplinary, interagency response, and the fundamental issue is about income, and that's certainly beyond the scope of CDI. Now I'm going to move on to the another question. So P. Mulvaney, and I should have asked Joe to introduce himself, but I can do that because I kind of know who you are. So Joe's the SIPSI coordinator here in South Dublin. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and then sharing your reflection or your question. P. Mulvaney.
Hello, hello everybody. I am in TU Dublin. I'm head of strategic projects there. I used to lecture in economics. I was head of the business school, and I'm currently I'm supervising some master's research in the area of community development. I'd like to congratulate you all on this work. For me, the greatest insight, I think, is that in terms of addressing these problems, that we address it from the eyes of the child and the children, independent of the parents, you know, where the causes of poverty could be a variety of factors, including unemployment, drug and alcohol, etc. Okay. And by the way, congratulate you on the methodology. That's the way I thought you would have done it, that you used the HP deprivation index. So that is one thing, that you have to see it from the eyes of the child, almost independent of, to a degree, the parents in the situation in which they find themselves, and therefore you have to focus on the education, the cultural outlets, all of this. I just query the issue of addressing it through poverty and income. Okay, I think we've all seen that it's multidimensional, and to a child, it's and what wasn't asked in any of those questions, it was all income related. It was, do you have shoes, do you have food, do you have this, rather than the critical thing for children is their relationships, you know, with their siblings, with their parents, with their friends. And it's not, you know, having a pair of shoes is and all of that is important, okay, but there are other factors that clearly influence the well-being of children, and therefore I think it's not so much the poverty, you know, as the well-being is the critical issue. And I think there were significant interruptions to services during COVID, which is clearly unfortunate. But going forward, you know, looking through the eyes of children, I think it's important to focus on those interventions that will reach out to the children, right, and support them. And I do think that there's nothing worse than that backlog of children's education has been uninterrupted and they've fallen behind. And like that can have a cumulative effect and a very, very deleterious effect on their development. And I think that is a key area that really needs to be addressed in a concerted way for these children going forward in the straight away. I'm talking about this year, next year, the strategy before it's too late. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful. Nice reflections there. Just to explain the list of items that Kat referred to is the list that's used in a number of kind of standardized assessments of poverty. In the work we did take a much more holistic approach to well-being, and children were asked about, you know, what's important in your life. It wasn't just the sort of factual stuff on that list that you would have seen. I'm going to go to Mary for a comment or question, and then unless there's anything else, I'm going to introduce the Minister then formally. So Mary, any reflections?
I just want to go back to Tanya's message of hope as well. Working 23 years in Tallaght, you become resilient and with the community. For me, the National Childcare Scheme is a massive resource to the community of Tallaght. And thanks to all agencies working together, we are funding childcare places for children at that early identified need. And for those in most need, they're sponsored and free in childcare settings. And the childcare settings have been amazing in supporting that National Childcare Scheme. So I just want to have that hope that strategies are coming, things are being implemented, even though we've so much more to do, Marion. I know the answers are not easy, but I'd like to flag it because it is about supporting the parents to get the education that they need to provide their children, but it's also about the early education of children as well, and sponsoring children across the HSE and TUSLA and the different agencies that are involved in that. We have a real commitment with that. So just want to kind of flag the hope message.
Thanks Mary, that's great, thank you for that. There's also a suggestion in the chat box from Maria Hayes in TUSLA that the LCDC and the CIPSI would come together to develop that local child poverty plan that Tanya referenced, and we do have Joe and Andy from the South Dublin LCDC here, so I'm going to leave that with you two to have a chat about and to think about how we might progress that, if that's okay. And if there are other parts of the country that want to help us to lead the way in how to do that, we'd be delighted to work with you. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to bring this part to a close, if that's okay, and we'll circulate the link to the report, but it's on our website, and I would really encourage you to have a look, because as I said, you've really only heard a very small part of the very significant work that Geoffrey led. Minister, I want to formally welcome you to the launch of our Over the Fence report. So Minister of State, Mr. Joe O'Brien, who's responsible for Community Development and Charities, located at the Department of Rural and Community Development. I've heard you speak previously, Minister, at a Children's Rights Alliance event on child poverty. We were really delighted when you accepted our invitation, because I know this is something that you're interested in and that you understand and are passionate about. So thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Marion, and good morning, everyone. And I really do appreciate the invitation to today's event, launching the Over the Fence report, funded by TUSLA, but I would like to thank everyone involved in the study. It's a very, very valuable piece of research, I think. And as Minister of State with responsibility for social inclusion in the Department of Social Protection and Community Development here in the Rural and Community Development Department, I've got an interest from a couple of perspectives in relation to the child poverty issue, and I'd really like to commend the work overall that's done by the Child Development Initiative as well. I did visit a number of community projects out in Tallaght earlier in the year and spoke directly with community workers and some young people as well about the issues impacting themselves, their families, but the wider community as well. And I can just say to you, there's a very strong resonance with what I heard that day and what's being laid out in the report as well. Particularly, I think, around community safety issues and mental health as well, that they were issues that came up when I visited earlier in the year. And I suppose we know that growing up in a marginalized and disadvantaged situation, experiencing intergenerational cycles of poverty, educational disadvantage, and/or unemployment will seriously hinder a child or a young person's opportunity in life. Poverty, social inclusion, social exclusion, or homelessness are not caused by children, and yet children are disproportionately affected by these issues. And someone earlier today mentioned that for children, this is the outcome of a lottery. And actually, that's a sentiment that has driven me in a lot of work that I've done, even before politics as well. There is an intrinsic unfairness, I think, in the outcomes for children, because they have really had no blame or direction in terms of what's happening with their lives in a lot of situations, I think. And today's report, like always before, it finds that income poverty is a key driver of household poverty. Not the only one, and I'll mention something about that later as well. But this is something that we also see reflected in the annual poverty data reported by the CSO in the survey on income and living conditions. And while the statistics themselves often can be somewhat cold and clinical, today's report, I think, fills out a lot of the gaps in a data-only report. It brings the real-life reality of poverty to life. The direct quotes, I think, in particular, and the fact that this piece is grounded in an actual community gives it extra life, gives it extra weight, gives it an enhanced capacity for us to engage with it as well, especially if we know the area, I think, or have been to the area. Now, as you may be aware, the Department of Social Protection does provide a number of income supports for families that work to help to alleviate and prevent child poverty. And child-related payments alone in 2020 amounted to 2.6 billion. And that's a big number, but I think within that, we've got a very effective tool in the qualified child payment in reaching those children most in need. And this is a payment in particular on the income side that I will continue to push in the annual budgetary process as well. And indeed, in recent years, there have been a number of measures that have helped in relation to early child poverty, the removal of the earnings limit on one-parent family payment, increases in the weekly income disregards, an increase in the working family payment earnings thresholds as well. However, despite all of these and other supports, we know that child poverty and poverty in general is still a very real issue, and there are too many people in this situation. And next week, of course, we see the announcement of Budget 22, and we have some difficult decisions in government to make every time this year, no more so than this year, I think, as the society and the economy continues to reopen following the pandemic-related restrictions. One of the real benefits of the report today is not just its examination of the issue of child poverty in and of itself, but also the many other factors that are intrinsically linked to the issue. And I think this echoes the approach of the Roadmap for Social Inclusion, which I'm responsible for, which recognises that access to public services is also very important, along with the income issue. The study also identified food poverty as a major challenge for families in Tallaght. And the issue of food poverty is addressed in the roadmap. And the roadmap, just to clarify for people, is the national strategy to reduce poverty and improve social inclusion in Ireland. And I'm very committed to achieving the targets set within it. And indeed, earlier this year, I decided to establish a working group on food poverty, which I chair. And this group brings together officials from relevant government departments, representatives from various NGOs, with a view to getting a better understanding of the issue, identifying and implementing possible solutions. And indeed, I was actually eager to have TUSLA's input into the group, and they made a very valuable contribution to the working group in the second meeting in July of this year. The group had its third meeting last week, and we're currently completing a mapping exercise of the supports provided across government at a national level to address food poverty, with a view to seeing how we can improve things and better link the supports already available. But I am also keen for the group to produce some concrete recommendations that will bring about real change for families. And we are hoping to tender for a piece of research before the end of the year that will help us to do that. I do know that the school meals programme provides a very welcome support to families in Dublin 24, with over 9,700 children in the area receiving meals through 32 schools and a number of family centres, community childcare settings and school completion programmes. Thankfully, it's not just Tallaght that benefits from the school meals programme, and its objective is to provide regular nutritious food to children who are unable, due to lack of good quality food, to take full advantage of the education provided to them. The programme is an important component of policies to encourage school attendance and extra education achievement, but in my view, it's got a much broader benefit, not just in terms of child development, but also community development. And I think the pilot of the Hot School Meals programme is particularly encouraging, and I'm certainly pushing for the growth of that particular initiative. The roadmap also states that implicit in its targets is the understanding that no child in Ireland should live in poverty, and that where it happens due to adverse circumstances, available supports should ensure that the child and their family exit poverty as soon as possible. The roadmap includes a specific commitment to continuing to target a reduction in poverty among children and families on low incomes as part of the annual budget process, along with commitments regarding the establishment of monitoring new child poverty targets at national and EU level. The government has also agreed to adopt the EU Child Guarantee, and this new guarantee aims to prevent and combat social exclusion by guaranteeing access for children who are in need of a range of key services. It also provides guidance and support for member states like Ireland to support children at risk of poverty or social exclusion. And it recognises that child poverty is a problem right across Europe, and though we may have experience of this in different ways, it is a problem across EU countries. So we have an additional policy or political reason, as if we needed one, to push harder for tackling child poverty, but we can have all the commitments and policy documents we want, but ultimately it demands us to put the resources where they are needed. And the European Commission emphasises that a child guarantee will only be effective if it triggers national investments and a supportive enabling policy framework. Design of the national action plans for its implementation will be crucial to its success, and a new national policy framework for children and young people for Ireland will be an essential future component working in parallel with the guarantee. My colleague, the Minister for Children, and his officials are working to develop a national action plan which will allow Ireland to provide these children with the services and supports they deserve. We want to provide free and effective access to early years education, childcare, primary and secondary education to children or young people in need. And it goes without saying that child poverty and our efforts to eradicate disadvantage for the most vulnerable will remain a top priority in our second national policy framework for children and young people. Additionally, a key commitment in both the programme for government and the roadmap for social inclusion is a reduction in the consistent poverty target to 2%. This is one you may have heard me speak about before, something I constantly highlight as I'm determined to make it a priority for government. It's a level of poverty that we've never achieved before. We've never got it down to that level before, so it's ambitious, and more so now than ever, I think, with the fallout of the pandemic. However, I am determined to keep highlighting that commitment and keep pushing for that commitment. We owe it, I think, to the children referred to in today's report and the children who speak in today's report and the families and individuals across Ireland to make that target and the child poverty targets a reality. And I can assure you of my commitment, but also the commitment of Minister O'Gorman and Minister Humphreys as well. Before I finish up, I do want to just recognise the role of the Social Inclusion and Community Activation Programme as well. It's a programme I oversee here in the Department of Rural Community Development, and to commend the work of South Dublin County Partnership in reaching those communities most in need. It provides one-to-one support for people who are suffering from poverty, but also supports organisations on the ground to build capacity and reach and help those people as well. And it's a programme that's got more potential, and it's a programme again that I'm pushing for in the upcoming budget negotiations for it to get bulked up. I do want to end on a note of positivity as well, and it's noted in the report. It's been mentioned this morning, and I've seen it firsthand myself when I visited Tallaght earlier this year. And there is a very strong sense of community, a sense of place, a love of one's place in Tallaght. And while acknowledging, I think, that the sense of community is somewhat under attack from some of the implications of poverty, such as neighbourhood safety, as outlined in the report, it is a very significant and valuable base to build from, I think, in terms of charting a way out of poverty and social exclusion. So I do want to commend all the service providers, but particularly the residents of Tallaght, who contribute their time to make Tallaght a better place and a place people can and are proud to be from. So thank you very much for the invitation today. I'm delighted now to formally launch this excellent piece of work. And yeah, thank you everyone for your contributions and this piece of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister, for those words, and also for a reminder about the policy context and some of the really important developments that are happening there. So look, folks, thank you so much for your time, for joining us on Zoom. It's great to see so many of you. So I hope that you go away and have a look at the report, and that it offers some insights that help all of us to collectively respond more effectively to what children and parents say that they need. So I just want to finally thank Mary and Cash and Tanya for your contributions this morning. Obviously, I want to thank Jeffrey for all the amazing work that he has done, but also everybody else here in CDI who has supported not just this piece of work, but also the range of really innovative evidence-informed services that we deliver and have delivered for over a decade now here in Tallaght and beyond. And finally, obviously, Minister, it was really great to have you with us this morning and to hear your reflections and some of your optimism around how our policy context can help us all move forward. So thank you very much, everybody. And there's been some really good suggestions about some next steps at local level. So we'll have to hold each other to progressing those. So let's make sure we do that. Thank you.